The Gordie Howe International Bridge stretches a mile and a half over the Detroit River, connecting Detroit, Michigan to Windsor, Ontario. It's named for the late Canadian hockey legend who spent 25 seasons skating for the Detroit Red Wings. A fitting symbol, you'd think, for a crossing meant to link two countries that have spent more than a century calling each other their closest ally. The bridge cost roughly $4.4 billion. Canada paid for almost all of it. Construction started back in 2018, and by the spring of 2026, the thing was basically done, tested, inspected, ready for cars and trucks to start rolling across it. A ribbon-cutting ceremony was scheduled for June 12th. It never happened. Without much public explanation, officials abruptly postponed the opening, saying only that the United States and Canada were still working through what they called outstanding issues. Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney was more blunt about it. He told reporters the delay happened at the request of the United States. In other words, this wasn't a construction problem, it wasn't a safety inspection, it was political. To understand how a finished bridge ends up sitting empty, you have to go back through almost a year of escalating tension between Donald Trump and Canada. Tension that, on the surface, is about tariffs and trade fairness, but that keeps circling back to grudges, vanity, and now, according to one Michigan Senate candidate, money. So let's rebuild the timeline. Back in 2017, during Trump's first term, the picture looked completely different. Trump met with then-Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and the two of them put out a joint statement celebrating infrastructure cooperation between their countries. They specifically praised what they called the expeditious completion of the Gordie Howe Bridge, describing it as a vital economic link. The bridge even made it onto a list of 50 priority infrastructure projects flagged for national security and emergency purposes during Trump's first term. He was, by his own branding, the builder president. He liked this bridge. He said so, publicly, in writing, with his name on it. That was the old relationship. Fast forward to last year, and the tone had completely flipped. Trump hit Canada with tariffs, 35% over the summer of 2025, citing what he called decades of unfair treatment. Canada had already imposed 25% retaliatory tariffs earlier that year on goods not covered by the existing trade agreement between the two countries, though those were lifted in August as both sides tried, at least nominally, to negotiate a deal. No deal ever got finalized. Then came October, and the moment that really lit the fuse, the Reagan ad. The Ontario provincial government, led by Premier Doug Ford, released a television commercial that spliced together audio from a 1987 radio address by President Ronald Reagan. In that speech, Reagan had warned that tariffs and trade barriers, while politically popular in the short term, ultimately hurt American workers and consumers and risk triggering trade wars. Ontario ran this ad, produced and paid for, an estimated 75 million Canadian dollars worth of airtime on major U.S. networks including Fox, NBC, and Newsmax, timed deliberately to reach an American audience, right as the U.S. Supreme Court was preparing to hear a case on the legality of Trump's tariffs. Trump did not take it well. He posted on Truth Social that the ad was fake, pointing to a statement from the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute, which said Ontario had used selective, misleadingly edited audio without ever asking permission to use Reagan's words. The foundation said it was reviewing legal options. Trump declared in all capital letters that all trade negotiations with Canada are hereby terminated. White House spokesperson Kush Desai backed that up, saying Ontario's taxpayer-funded ad campaign was the latest example of Canada playing games instead of negotiating in good faith. Doug Ford, for his part, didn't exactly apologize at first. He said the ad was factual, that it was simply Ronald Reagan's own words, and that every Republican is going to identify that voice. But within a day, facing the collapse of trade talks, Ford announced he'd pause the campaign so negotiations could resume, though he made a point of letting it keep running through the weekend specifically so it would air during Game 1 and Game 2 of the World Series, reaching the largest possible American television audience before going dark. Trump's response to that bit of defiance was to raise tariffs on Canada by an additional 10%, on top of what was already in place, citing what he called Canada's serious misrepresentation of the facts and hostile act. A week or so later, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney personally apologized to Trump over the ad. Whether that apology actually repaired the relationship is, frankly, an open question, because what happened next suggests it didn't repair much of anything. In January, at the World Economic Forum in Davos, Trump told the room that Canada lives because of the United States. Carney, responding in a filmed address from Quebec City, pushed back hard, saying, "Canada does not live because of the United States. Canada thrives," he said, "because we are Canadian." Carney also used that moment to tell other so-called middle powers not to be pushed around by larger nations using economic pressure as leverage, and to stop being nostalgic for an old global order that, in his words, is not coming back. That exchange seemed to set Trump off again. By the end of January, he was threatening to decertify all aircraft manufactured in Canada and floated a 50% tariff on Canadian-made planes. And then, on February 9th, with no real warning, he turned his attention to the bridge. In a lengthy Truth Social post, Trump declared he would not allow this bridge to open until the United States is fully compensated for everything we have given them, and added that Canada needed to start treating the United States with what he called the fairness and respect it deserves. He listed several grievances in that same post: that Ontario still refuses to put American liquor and spirits back on store shelves, a boycott the province imposed in protest of U.S. tariffs, and that Premier Ford is kept in place, saying flatly, "It's an irritant," and that the simplest fix would be for the U.S. to drop the tariffs that caused it in the first place. Trump also brought up Canadian tariffs on American dairy products and a recent trade deal Canada struck with China. But the most striking claim in that post was about ownership and construction. Trump suggested the bridge was solely Canadian property, when in fact it's jointly owned by Canada and the state of Michigan under a 2012 agreement. He also blamed former President Barack Obama for allowing the bridge to be built, in his words, with virtually no U.S. content, even though American steel and American workers were both used in construction on the Michigan side of the river. Windsor's mayor, Drew Dilkens, pushed back on that point directly, telling Canadian broadcasters that U.S. steel went into the build. Carney himself made the same point to reporters in Ottawa, saying plainly, "I explained to the president that Canada paid for the bridge, firstly. Secondly, it's a property shared between the state of Michigan and the Canadian government, and there were American steel and workers involved." There's also a wrinkle in that February post that journalists at ProPublica dug into. They found that Trump's language, questioning the bridge's value, suggesting it was built unfairly, closely echoed talking points from a 2018 advertisement paid for by the company that owns a rival, privately operated crossing, the Ambassador Bridge, which has connected Detroit and Windsor since 1929. That bridge belongs to the Moran family, and that 2018 ad had specifically urged the federal government to review the presidential permit allowing the Gordie Howe Bridge to be built in the first place, because obviously a brand new public bridge represents direct competition to the toll revenue the Morans have collected for nearly a century. According to ProPublica's reporting, just hours before Trump's February post went up, the billionaire owner of the Ambassador Bridge, Matthew Moran, met with U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. Lutnick then reportedly spoke with Trump by phone about the matter. Messages sent to email addresses linked to Moran went unanswered. The Ambassador Bridge company itself declined to comment. Reaction in Canada to the February threat was sharp. Windsor Mayor Drew Dilkens called it insane, telling CBC News he genuinely couldn't believe what he was reading, and said the moment should have been one where a prime minister and a president meet in the middle of a finished bridge and shake hands, not another flashpoint in a trade war. U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer offered a more measured transactional framing on Fox Business, saying the United States needed to make sure it gets, in his words, its fair share of any proceeds from that bridge and the economic activity that it generates, suggesting the administration saw this less as a grievance and more as a negotiating chip. Carney told reporters the dispute would be resolved and said Trump had asked U.S. Ambassador to Canada Pete Hoekstra to help smooth over the bridge conversation specifically. But months passed. June 12th came and went with no ribbon cutting. The bridge, paid for, built, tested, and ready, just sat there. And that delay is where Michigan politics enters the story directly. On June 24th, 2026, Michigan State Senator Mallory McMorrow, a Democrat running in a closely watched three-way primary for U.S. Senate, released a new ad. It was the second spot in her campaign's advertising series, backed by an initial buy of more than $400,000 across television and digital platforms in the Detroit market, and the Associated Press got first access to it before it went out to newsrooms nationwide. The ad is simple, visually. McMorrow stands in front of the Gordie Howe Bridge itself, finished, gleaming, completely unused, and speaks directly to camera. "I'm Mallory McMorrow," she says, "and I have one message for the president. Open this damn bridge." She argues the bridge is ready. She argues it's sitting closed for one specific reason. And then she makes the accusation that turned this from a local infrastructure story into a national one. The billionaire family that owns the other bridge gave him $1 million. That's a direct reference to the Marowns, and it's not a baseless leap. Federal campaign finance records confirm that Matthew Marown donated $1 million to a Trump-aligned super PAC earlier in 2026. The timing lines up with the same period when Trump escalated his rhetoric about the bridge, and with the same family whose 2018 ad language Trump's own February post seemed to echo, according to ProPublica's reporting. But here's where it's worth slowing down and being precise about what is fact and what is still allegation, because that distinction matters, and several outlets, including the fact-checking site Snopes, have taken pains to spell it out. Two separate claims are bundled together in McMorrow's ad. The first claim, that Trump is blocking the bridge from opening, is verified. Carney said so directly, on the record, stating the delay happened at the request of the United States. The Windsor-Detroit Bridge Authority has only said the opening was held up by unresolved issues, without specifying what those issues are. The second claim, that the blockage exists specifically to protect or reward the Marown family's competing toll bridge because of that $1 million donation, is, by every honest accounting, still speculation. It's well-sourced speculation. It's speculation built on a documented meeting between Marown and Lutnick, a documented phone call between Lutnick and Trump, language that mirrors a years-old Marown-funded ad campaign, and a verified seven-figure donation with suspicious timing. But nobody, not McMorrow, not ProPublica, not any administration official, has produced a smoking gun document or direct admission proving cause and effect. The Trump administration, for its part, has offered a different official rationale through USTR Jamieson Greer, that this is fundamentally about the United States getting its fair share of the bridge's economic activity, framed as leverage in broader trade negotiations rather than a favor to a campaign donor. So why is this ad landing the way it is? Context matters here, and the Michigan Senate race is unusually crowded and unusually well-funded for this stage in the cycle. McMorrow is competing against U.S. Representative Haley Stevens, who has significantly more financial resources and institutional backing, and against Abdul El-Sayed, a former gubernatorial candidate who has carved out support from the party's progressive wing, including a notable endorsement from Senator Bernie Sanders. McMorrow herself has openly described her campaign as a dark horse effort from the very start. Outside spending has already poured into the race at a scale that's hard to ignore. A political action committee connected to the American Israel Public Affairs Committee has spent nearly $8 million this month alone boosting Stevens. A super PAC supporting McMorrow, called Yes Michigan Action Committee, has reserved close to $6 million in advertising. Whoever wins the Democratic primary is expected to face Republican Mike Rogers, who lost Michigan's last open Senate race to now Senator Alyssa Slotkin. Rogers, notably, has also tried to use the bridge controversy for his own political messaging, saying that if voters send him to Washington, he'll personally make sure the bridge gets opened, which tells you something about just how toxic this delay has become across party lines in Michigan, a state where the bridge represents thousands of jobs and a major economic artery, not just a symbol. McMorrow described the broader strategic landscape bluntly in her interview with the Associated Press, saying her two primary opponents were trying to present voters with what she called a false binary choice, essentially arguing that the race isn't just a two-person contest the way much of the coverage has framed it. The bridge ad is part of a larger anti-corruption message she's tried to make central to her entire campaign, tying Trump's conduct in office to concrete, visible consequences for Michigan voters, jobs not created, trade not flowing, a literal bridge sitting empty across the river. It's worth stepping back and asking the obvious question: why would any president of either party want to block the opening of a finished, already paid-for bridge that creates jobs and boosts trade in a swing state he presumably wants to win? CNN's analysis of the February threat framed it this way: that Trump may simply be using the bridge as leverage. He mentioned Ontario's liquor boycott. He mentioned dairy tariffs. Those are exactly the kinds of issues that would come up in any renegotiation of the broader trade agreement between the U.S. and Canada, the one that's set to replace the existing USMCA framework Trump signed during his first term. From that angle, holding the bridge hostage is simply a pressure tactic, a way to force concessions on issues that have nothing to do with the bridge itself. CNN's framing also pointed out the irony sitting underneath all of this. Trump spent years during his first term promising Mexico would pay for a border wall. Mexico never did. Now, years later, Canada has fully funded, built, and finished a bridge entirely on its own. Exactly the kind of infrastructure cooperation Trump used to celebrate. And instead of cutting a ribbon, he's threatening to keep it shut until he gets more. Whether the real motive is trade leverage, personal grievance over the Reagan ad humiliation, a favor to $1 million donor, some combination of all three, or something else entirely, is something we genuinely don't know yet. What we do know, confirmed on the record by the Canadian Prime Minister himself, is that a fully completed, fully funded binational bridge between two of the closest economic partners on Earth is sitting closed because the President of the United States won't let it open. The Gordie Howe Bridge was supposed to be a symbol of cooperation, literally named after a man who spent his career skating across the same river the bridge now spans, beloved on both sides of the border. For now, it's a symbol of something else entirely, a relationship between two allies that has gone from joint statements praising vital economic links in 2017 to canceled trade talks over a Reagan ad in 2025 to a finished bridge nobody's allowed to drive across in 2026, and a Michigan Senate candidate standing in front of it asking the president, in plain language, to open the damn thing. What happens next depends on factors well outside Michigan's control: ongoing trade negotiations, the Supreme Court's eventual ruling on the legality of Trump's broader tariff authority, and whatever quiet diplomacy is or isn't happening between Washington and Ottawa. But politically, the bridge isn't going away as an issue. It's now baked into one of the most competitive Senate races in the country, a tangible, photographable, drivable symbol that voters in Michigan will be looking at, or rather not driving across, right up until they cast their ballots.